Hi, everybody. I'm Ashley Sherwood. I work at HubSpot, and I'm going to talk today about designing more informative data models with dbt. Since we're not in person, I wanted to start with a little bit more of an introduction of myself. As I mentioned, I work at HubSpot. We're a software as a service company, and we sell what I like to call customer experience software. So the idea is to empower, especially small businesses, to give their customers a really wonderful experience from the moment that they first hear of that company all the way through their purchase and their long-term success with that company. And because this is a digital presentation, I have to comply with the cat tax. So here is my cat Pancake, and she's actually sitting next to me, sleeping on the chair, helping me through this presentation. So when starting a presentation like this, I love to do the thing where you define words from the title of your presentation. So I'm going to do that. The first one is informative. So informative means imparting knowledge. And I really latched onto that here because that to me so nicely sums up the purpose of analytics and being an analyst in my perspective. It's to impart knowledge to the people who can make good use of it. Another piece of the title that can be deceptively difficult to define is model. I think this is a word that we use a lot, but when you're asked what exactly is a data model, it can be a little bit difficult to pin down. So I have done the other classic with this presentation trick and picked the definition that best fits my talk, which is number 10 on the list, which is a structural design. So a model is a structural design that hopefully, in the context of data, helps to impart knowledge. Another way to think about this is we may have access to the data that we need, but until it's in a structure that we can work with, we won't get much use out of it. I'm a very visual person, so I like to visualize this problem, and my favorite metaphor for it, which my coworkers have heard before, is the Lego brick metaphor. So we'll say, all right, well, we've got all the Lego bricks that we need, but they look like this right now. Because this is a stage in a project that can be really difficult to communicate to a stakeholder. They're like, okay, we have this question, can we do it? And I'm like, yeah, we can. All the stuff's in our data lake, all the pieces are being collected, but it looks like this, and we can't really use it until it looks like this. So in this case, this is a structured design. The purpose of it is clear from the structure, and the structure is helping it to actually achieve the purpose that it has. The other reason that data models and structural design is really important is computers are dumb. So the way that a computer is going to store and want to process information, and by computer here I mean your data warehouse, your source system, a little bit above machine language, but even to that extent as well, the way that a computer wants to store and work with information is not natural or usable for a human to actually use that information to get insight. So generally, when we're getting things from computers, it looks like this. We have a pile of Lego bricks and we need to do something with them. That can lead to another challenge of, okay, great, you're a master builder. You know how to turn all of those shiny bricks into a nice house, but what do you build? And I think some of us are on small enough teams that we might be working so closely with stakeholders that, you are playing that full route from the very, very back end to presenting it to the executive board. But a lot of us aren't in that position. We need other people to help us figure out what to build, regardless of how good our building skills are. So ideally, in that situation, you find a teacher. If you're partnering with a business unit, hopefully you can find a business expert who, while you are dreaming about how to best optimize join aggregations, they're dreaming about sales cycles and what makes the customer success team tick. And it's not quite enough or it's not quite effective to try to get that business user to make a tidy little requirements package for you. Ideally, you're just learning about the business. And sometimes you might not know how it's going to be applicable. Sometimes you might not immediately be able to solve a problem. But as an analyst, the more you can digest about the business, the better position you'll be in to really help facilitate that building process down the line. I'm really lucky to have a colleague on my team whose name is Bill, who is this business expert and has taught me so much about how our business works at HubSpot. We've been able to collaborate really closely together and get to some outcomes that are really exciting. So I'm going to share with you guys today a specific example of that on a project that we completed in the beginning and middle of last year. So to do that, I'll give you a little bit more background on the group that we work with. We are the strategy and operations team for the HubSpot Global Solutions Partner Program. Now, as I mentioned, HubSpot is a customer experience software, so we sell that, but we don't sell it alone. We often work with other small businesses who are often themselves customers of our product who provide services that are in this area. The classic example is a digital marketing agency works with HubSpot to both sell the HubSpot product to a new small business and help them really get set up on HubSpot. So a digital marketing agency can do things that we can't do, like help that customer write their blog posts, do photography with them, do their business strategy. And along the way, they might find customers that we never would have talked to. Somebody could go to a web design expert asking about building a new website, and that web design agency could determine for them that HubSpot is a really good fit for them to host their website. So we sell with these partners for about half of the business that we do. That leads to us asking a lot of questions about this program, one of which was, how many solutions partners are actively selling with us, and what has been the trend? Now, an astute reader will pick out that actively is pretty vague here. This is where I was really lucky to be working with a business expert, because Bill had been agonizing over this definition for months and years. And so we were able to start from a really nice business definition of what this activity meant to us. So we were looking at whether or not those partners have resold with us at least one new customer in the trailing 12 months. So I was ready to dig in. All right, let's get into the data. And as you so often do when you're starting with sales, I started with transaction level data. This is actual transaction level data from HubSpot, hence the obfuscation. And as you can see, we are pretty easily able to identify whether or not something has been sold by a partner with us. Okay, great. This is a dimension. I've got some aggregates here. We have this 12-month period. Let's aggregate it. So this was the first thing that we put together. We're like, all right, we're looking at those transactions for the past 12 months, where a partner was selling with us, and then our aggregates are doing a lot of the work for us here. So we've got the total dollars sold. That's great. Unique customer count. Perfect. And unique partner count. Like, great, this answers the question. This is the number of partners who've sold with us in the past 12 months. So the second piece was, well, what's the trend? And that's where this got tricky. So my first instinct was, well, pull in the dimension for year. That doesn't actually end up making sense, because now you're looking at some sales from 2020 and some sales from 2019. Then you kind of start to go down this rabbit hole of like, well, maybe I could make a custom dimension where one bucket is the last 12 months and there's another bucket that's 12 months before that. But that gets to the fundamental issue here of, well, if I want to compare May to April, I have to include April in both of those views, because each is a trailing 12 months view. And there's fundamentally no way in an aggregate like this, in a dimensional model like this, to include the same month's transaction in two dimensions in the same view. So being the resourceful analyst that I am, I immediately looked to do a manual solution in a spreadsheet. So I was like, all right, I could filter this report to each 12-month window, then export that data, and then repeat that, and then I'd have a trend. But that led to the light bulb moment. Well, if I can do that, that means I have all of the Lego pieces that I need. The problem is just putting them into the right structure so that they'll work in the way that we need them to work. I was really fortunate at the time to have recently discovered dbt via a colleague at HubSpot. I had used it a little bit to build some basic data models in our area, and I was excited for the chance to build something a little bit more complex and to leverage dbt so that I could do that much more quickly. I could do that with testing, and I could explore and kind of venture out into that area of building a more complex data model so much more efficiently than I could working in raw SQL. So at HubSpot, we use Snowflake and Looker primarily. Snowflake is our data warehouse, and Looker is our visualization tool. And at this point in time, I had kind of developed a little bit of a hacky trick to where I could have DBT do the modeling for me, do the compiling for me, and then I would slot that into our standard process, which was to do raw SQL scripts hosted with Airflow. So I'm in DBT, we're ready to go, and start to kind of explore this solution. So it turns out that whenever you're looking at a problem where you need to compare these like sliding date windows. So, you know, as of May, I want to look trailing 12. As of April, I want to look trailing 12. That's a really good sign that you might want to start with the dates table. I skipped ahead a little bit. Before we get there, when you're building the new structure, it's really important to start with the foundation. And as I just demonstrated, it's very easy to get ahead of yourself in this process. And when you're building a real house, you cannot start with a roof. You have to start with a foundation. But when you're building data, when you're building a Lego house, you can start with the roof. It might not be the best way to go about it, but you can get away with it. So in this case, we really needed to get to the foundation of this question. How many partners have sold in the last 12 complete months? The underlying question there is actually, how long has it been since the partner's last sale? This lets us answer not only the given question, but also what I like to call adjacent questions, which are the other questions that are right there next to it, that are like next off your tongue as soon as you start talking about it, but that you might have missed in the initial conversation if you were so set on getting the first question defined. So when you reshift the question in this way, there's a really good sign if the new question makes it much more clear what the structure should be. That's a good clue that you're along the right path in finding a good foundational question. So now that we're thinking about how long it's been since the partner's last sale, it's a little bit more easy to approach our dates. So as of January, we want to have some sort of data structure that can look back over the past transactions that are before January 31st and say, this one's the most recent. We want to do that for February. And in this example, there's not been any new sales. So, okay, cool. December 31st is still their most recent sale. Let's do it from the perspective of March. There's a new sale in March. So in March, we now have this updated most recent sold date. The great thing about doing something like this in DBT and in SQL is this type of logic and structuring is what SQL is so good at. A query will be so much better at this for you than a spreadsheet or a lookup. So the query looks something like this, and there's really only two pieces to it that make it work exactly how we need it to. The first is to say, let's go to all of our sales transactions. We have dates for those. And as of this report date, grab only the dates that are before the report date. And then we can say, of that group that we just grabbed, who's the most recent? And that's just a max aggregate. So with a simple join condition and an aggregate, we now have a table that has that most recent sold date for all of these dates in history. Once that's in a table format, it's really straightforward to calculate how many months it's been since the last sale. And then to go on and say, well, have they resold in the trailing 12 months? But this became another decision point in this process. So I had identified that months since last sold was the foundation. And I could build out in DBT and host in Snowflake all of these different labels and Booleans and buckets. But in this case, I had a business user who was kind of coming to meet me in the middle with this data structure. So I was like, okay, I can give you months since last sold for any date in history. Do you want to work with the buckets? Do you want to iterate with those? He did. So the better way to do this for us was to not do the business logic in Snowflake, but actually to have that live in Looker. So this is some of the LookML that feeds this reporting. And it shows some of the other adjacent questions that we were able to answer by giving those months since last sold directly to the business user, to our business analyst. So in this case, we could say something like a dormancy. Like, okay, if they haven't sold in 2 years, let's call them dormant. If they have sold in the past 2 years, but not the last year, let's call them newly dormant. And this was something that Bill, my colleague, could take into a report and experiment with. We could tweak the ranges. We could add new dimensions, really go back and forth and work together to come up with a really nice set of dimensions to describe these partners. So still building just up from that framework of months since last sold, this lets us say for any of our partners at any month in time, whether they were newly dormant, they'd sold in the past 12 months but been dormant before, which we called resurrected, whether they'd been selling actively with us or whether they'd never sold. With this framework, the report to show that trend over time was as simple as the report dimension and account. And then from there, we got our trend. And from there, we had actual insight into what was happening in our partner accounts over time. This seems at first like, maybe just some nice to know information about our program, but actually this helped us plan headcount for 2020 because we had for the first time an understanding of which of our partners were selling with us, how many of them, and especially how many of them we expected to stop selling over time. We'd been able to report on how many new sellers that we had, but never that attrition of sellers falling off. And this let us actually bring a lot of pieces together for our 2020 planning in a really exciting and new way. So to summarize for you guys, the way that I like to describe this is that mutual understanding with business experts results in apt data structures or models that successfully impart knowledge. Thank you guys so much for coming today, and thank you for your time.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Ashley. That was incredible. If anyone has a question, feel free to drop it in the chat. I'm going to get us started with one. First of all, I've never heard the term cat tax before, and I love it. So unfortunately, I don't have a cat. But if I did, I would totally adopt that. One thing that I'm interested in is you mentioned that you've used this to plan for headcount for 2020. Have you used this in any other ways? Like, are you looking at the sellers who have churned or that sort of attrition group, as you named it, and investing any efforts in reconnecting with them? Or what are some other ways that you're looking at using the insights generated by this analysis?
That's a great question. We're in the process now of kind of understanding that segmentation. So identifying a group that attrits and trying to look for leading indicators of groups that might stay engaged versus groups that don't, but also looking for those point-in-time interventions. This is relatively new data for us, so we're just kind of getting into what we can do with it. But one of the things that we've been able to identify so far is that the partners who sell faster with us, who sell earlier in their time with us, tend to sell more and tend to stay more active. So that helps us know that focusing on those initial few months with us and focusing on their onboarding experience can be a really high return.
That's really cool. In terms of the work to like identify those leading indicators, I assume someone's using like the models that you've already built and then working on top of that. What does that workflow look like?
That's a great question. So when it comes to our kind of strategic development and how we look at the business long term, those models usually end up living in a spreadsheet. The main reason for that being that those
you pick one of those and you do one every single day.
Sorry.
So every day you challenge yourself. Or
Janessa, are you cool?
All right, cool.
Hi, folks. True dashboarding. This API is presently undocumented. Way to program Tableau extract refreshes in.
You're the host. Can you mute everyone?
Oh, I'm the host?
I think so.
Oh, sorry. Let's see what I can do.
There we go. I think the relevant one is muted.
Okay.
All right, cool.
Sorry about that, Ashley. So we're talking about...
That's all good. So talking about that workflow of, actually going to use that data. So a lot of our kind of business models end up living in the spreadsheet. And the main reason for that is that kind of cell-based control ends up being very helpful to those long-term strategic models where you can come up with some assumptions and really tweak them live. So what that usually ends up looking like for the workflow is a business analyst who's doing that kind of broad strategy. So in this case, Bill was actually doing that analysis. We'll work with somebody like me to kind of ask some initial questions and come up with a framework. And then something from Looker, like that report we shared with the active partners over time, we'll export that into Excel. And then what we did for this model was Bill went through and based off of those historic trends and other things we knew about the business, projected those numbers forward. And then we were able to collaborate on that as well, where he would run with it and take it more to the business users into that kind of deep strategic application. But I could still help consult along the way to make sure that we were kind of using the data framework in the way that had been intended to, and making sure that it was working the way that we had expected, and that it was clear enough to use.
Cool. I love this idea of like meeting people in the middle in terms of like the tools they're comfortable in, like meeting Bill in Looker, and then like, you know, being like, it's totally cool to export this to Excel and do some extra work there. We've got a question from Jeff Albro. Jeff, do you want to unmute yourself and introduce yourself and then ask that question?
Hi, I'm Jeff Albro from Boston. I work at a financial company. I haven't been using DBT heavily yet, but I've been reading about it and I've built a lot of my SQL models really along the same lines. One of the things I'm working with is like, how do I get analysts to understand the models I make or to not get misled by something? So, you know, one option I'm looking at is like lots of different models for very custom things. So how do you deal with, you know, an analyst says, oh, I need something else, and you build them a new model, and now all of a sudden you got, you know, 15, 20 models. How are you dealing with that proliferation and documentation?
That's a really great question. And I think it's a bit of a consistent challenge. But what I will do in that case is try to keep the documentation as close to the model as possible. If you can get people also working in DBT, that works really well because you're documenting in DBT. If you're working across a team and they're not using the tool yet, that's where you'll have to get a little bit creative. Embedding SQL comments directly in the model can be helpful. You can do DBT comments that will show up in the DBT model file, but not in the SQL. In my case, we were still orchestrating with raw SQL files. So for my DBT files, I would comment in SQL, and then that would get compiled as part of the template and then be available in the repo that everybody else was working from. I'll also sometimes embed a hyperlink within the documentation. It's not the most elegant option, but it really works. It's like, all right, here's the wiki page, and at least if you're interested in it, you can get to it, and that can be helpful as well. And I think it's something that you want to stay open to refactoring as time goes on. You might find that many of those models are similar and can be condensed.
Are you giving people one flat table or a star schema?
That's a good question. In this case, what I've kind of carved out for our partner data is more of a schema where I'm flattening tables together for people to use so that in any given application, they have most of the information that they need, but there's still some denormalization there. So it's a hybrid approach that's focused on readability as opposed to data storage optimization. And that's what I'd recommend. I'd recommend optimizing for readability and reusability. So that's what I've tried to do. So if these three tables will always want to be used together, I just go ahead and flatten them together. But there are other types of modularity that are really useful. So we have a few different kinds of relationships that a partner can have with a customer. So instead of flattening those with the account information, I'll join the relationships separately, and then I can use that accounts information per each of those relationships. And then I only have to have one view for accounts information, but I can join it to any version of account ID that we want. So that's a case where I've kept those separate so that they can be reused in that way.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Ashley. That was an amazing presentation.